we have heard and we will continue to hear from guests on this program who are Muslim, who are of any religion or background from the 7 countries involved in the Trump Muslim travel, so-called Muslim travel ban. Not a bad description. And I think it's also important to look at the best way that the American Jewish community might want to respond to this issue. Joining us now to discuss that with us, rejoining us, I should say, because we've had her on the program before, is Rebecca Vilkomerson. Rebecca is Executive Director of Jewish Voice for Peace, and she joins us now. Rebecca, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let me start with this. Just on the broadest level, you and I have talked about the subject before of the Trump campaign and of bigotry in its various forms. Did we ever think it would come to this? A ban this sweeping?
Did we ever think it would come to this?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the question I ask myself every day. And I have to say that I am usually very much an optimist, and I surprise myself that since the day after the election, my sort of instinct has been prepare for the worst, prepare for the worst, prepare for the worst. And even having prepared for the worst, I've found it incredibly shocking how fast the administration has moved to implement some of the worst policies that it was bringing up on the campaign trail. And I think, and not just the policies that is brought up, but the way that the administration is being implemented, and the appointments that are being made, and this week especially with the appointments that were passed. I think everything about what we've seen from the Trump administration so far is immensely, immensely distressing and disturbing. I will say the flip side of that has also been a surprise is I was very, very moved by the response to the Muslim ban in particular. I think we all knew post-inauguration that there was going to be the big women's marches. I thought those were very important on the very first day of the administration. But I think we expected to be out with a small group of organizations against the Muslim ban. And instead what we found was this sort of mass outpouring on the streets. And it's just part of this larger outpouring of resistance against all different facets of the Trump administration thus far. So I think that's very, very encouraging. So I find myself very much swinging between hope and fear, and sort of, at a sense of like, okay, this resistance is happening, and there's a mass movement happening in a way that I don't really remember in my lifetime, but at the same time that we're up against something very, very scary.
I think that's a great summary of my reaction as well. Both the fear and the hope, and especially, I think that the political forces in this country had done a great job a tragically great job of marginalizing Muslim Americans, and I did not expect the outpouring of support. And I want to talk about what you experienced on the organizational side. I know just going to the demonstrations here in Washington, I was just deeply moved by the sentiment, by the size of the crowd, by the passion, by the embrace of the other, that they were trying to make an other by, with this ban. And of course, by the sign that paraphrased Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a sign I can't fully articulate on the air, but it began, first they came for the Muslims, and we said, not today, MF. And, I think all of that, the passion, the brother and sisterhood, the determination, all of that was extremely encouraging. At the same time, we have the issue of what's going on with Israeli policy as well. And what are your reactions to the early signs we're seeing from the Trump administration on that?
I'm sorry, I lost you for a minute, so I missed your question. Could you say it again?
I'm saying at the same time that we're seeing the hope and fear domestically in terms of the Muslim ban and trying to lift that, the Trump administration has also begun to at least speak and take initial actions on changes in Israeli policy. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. You cut out again just when you were saying, when you said the Trump administration has begun to take initiative, and then I lost you. I'm so sorry.
On Israeli policy.
On Israeli policy, yeah. So I think we're going to see a lot about what's going to happen next week. Next week is going to be a big week for the Israel-U.S. relationship. We know that Trump has campaigned very much on shifting the Israeli-U.S. relationship back after what has been perceived, at least on the sort of more right-wing side of the American Jewish spectrum, that Obama wasn't a good friend to Israel, and they didn't trust him, and they didn't think he had Israel's best interest at heart, and they thought he spoke too much about Palestinian rights. Of course, the truth is that under Obama, an increase in military aid to Israel was approved in the last year of his administration, when Israel already got more military aid than any other country in the world. So I think that there was some light verbal criticisms of Israeli policy in the previous administration, but no actual heft behind those criticisms. So Israel has had pretty much free reign among both Democratic and Republican administrations, certainly for the last several administrations, going back to the first Bush administration. But that being said, Trump seems to have a real affinity for Netanyahu and vice versa. Netanyahu, tweeted something saying that he approved of Israel's of the U.S. wall, and sort of said, that's what we did. We built a wall on our borders. We have Jared Kushner, who of course is an important advisor to Trump and is also his son-in-law, who is known to be very right-wing. His proposed appointee as ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, is someone who is actually like a real settlement champion. He raises money for a very extreme settlement in the West Bank. So all the indications are that the Netanyahu and Trump approach to the security state, approach to, like you were saying, the othering of Muslims and Arabs, and the kind of true believer sort of sense of like Islamophobia, anti-Muslim sentiment, and supporting expansion of the settlement, supporting annexation of land, and the repression of Palestinian rights will be the Trump administration approach to Israel during this time. And I will say one thing that's been interesting for me, in seeing this incredible outpouring against the Muslim ban here in the United States, including from a pretty broad swath of the Jewish community. One of the things I want to be talking about in the Jewish community is, if people are so upset about Trump's policies here, why aren't they more upset about the ongoing Israeli policies that are actually quite similar, that have been going on for decades in Israel? So that's a conversation I'm interested in having as this administration continues.
And if we don't want people to travel here, and that's disturbing as it should be, and there are cases where people can't even stay in their homes. And in fact, Netanyahu's right. Israel did build a wall. Isn't that correct? They have a wall in Israel.
Israel has a wall. Yes, Israel has a wall. It's a wall that actually, in the building of the wall, it stole Palestinian land and moved the borders, the sort of like what are considered to be the 1967 potential borders. They went out beyond them and annexed land. And of course, the wall itself has not actually served the supposed security purpose that it has. And so I think the fact that the U.S. is under Trump is saying that this is a good example for something that we could do. It's just a disaster waiting to happen. The wall's been nothing but it's a human rights disaster. It's a fundamental, people's elemental rights are being violated by it every single day. So just on a human scale, it's a disaster, but also in terms of policy, it's a disaster. It has not done a thing to bring peace to Palestinians and Israelis.
And we have the same problem with settlements, where I think the Obama administration has allowed settlement building largely to continue, and Trump seems like he'll accelerate it. What happens if Israel builds even more settlements on Palestinian land?
I mean, they are already building more settlements on Palestinian land. Netanyahu has already announced and something like 3,000 more units of housing just in the settlements just in the last week or so. And also, I think very, very significantly, the Israeli Knesset passed a bill a couple of days ago that basically legalizes theft of Palestinian land. It literally says that Israel has the ability to steal land from Palestinians, and in order to build more settlements. Now, this has been the practice of Israel for quite a long time, but to try to make it a legal, formal practice, I mean, maybe in some ways it's good because it sort of brings out into the open practices that have been a little bit obscured. But what it basically does is it says, like, yes, we are an apartheid state. Yes, we are taking the land that we conquered in the occupation and permanently settling it in a way that's against international law. And so, Israel can't just erase international law, but that's what they're attempting to do with this new bill and with that just passed. And so, I think many people at this point think that the idea of a two-state solution has already passed. And so continued settlement will only, first of all, again, in human terms, continues to horrifically impact the daily lives of Palestinians, but also it just makes it harder and harder to get to a two-state solution, which maybe does open up a conversation to a one-state solution. The idea of a place that has equal rights for everyone from the river to the sea, which is a conversation I think a lot of people have been wanting to have for a long time.
Well, it's a conversation I think that should be held, but I don't understand the right-wing argument in our Jewish American community that says that it's a good thing for Israel to allow it to pursue these actions, because I think in the long run it's going to be incredibly harmful for Israel in its current, at least as it exists today. Do you agree that it will be harmful in the long run to let Netanyahu do whatever he wants?
I totally agree that it's really bad for Israel and for Israelis. And I think that's the really frustrating thing, is that for Israelis who would like to live in peace with their neighbors, the United States policies have continued to empower the right wing, and the Trump administration is only going to continue to empower more extreme edges of the right wing. And that is not going to end up anywhere good for anyone, whether Palestinians or Israelis.
Yeah, I completely agree. And last question, Rebecca Vilkomerson. Might be depressing answer, but where do you see the future going in terms of Israel and U.S.-Israel relations? What do you see in the future?
I think it depends if you're talking about the short-term future or the long-term future. I certainly think in the very short term, it's very, very bleak. I think we're going to see Trump and Netanyahu reinforcing each other in all of their worst practices. But in the long term, I think that the long term is against them. And I think a big part of that is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is a call from Palestinians globally for people to boycott and divest and sanction Israel until it stops violating Palestinian rights. And that's created a burgeoning global movement that is rising. And I think it's reflected here in the United States, and in particular in the American Jewish community. And that's why JVP has been growing so much over the past few years, because more and more people, and there's definitely a generational split, more and more people understand that Palestinians are the occupied and Israel is the occupier, and that from an ethical and moral and also even strategic perspective, that's not a policy that we want to either tolerate or foment, and that it's not going to, like you were saying earlier, it's not going to end up in a good place. And so I think different people are taking that position for different reasons, but there is it's clear in every poll, it's clear from the growth that we're seeing that things are shifting here in the United States, and we're getting closer to in line with the rest of the world, which has somewhat of a consensus on this. And I do think that Trump's positioning right now and alignment with Netanyahu is further isolating the United States from the rest of the world. And I think when Trump falls, which I certainly hope he will, Israel is going to find itself more isolated than ever.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary of what we're about to see. And where can people go to find out more about your organization?
Thank you so much for asking. They can go to www.jvp.org. That's www.jewishvoiceforpeace.org. Either one will work.
Okay, great. And thank you so much for working on these issues. Rebecca Vilkomerson, Executive Director of Jewish Voice for Peace. And thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.